This year again, we are faced with the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic. Unlike last year, however, we are blessed with a number of effective vaccines from which to choose to protect ourselves. Additionally, we still have measures like mask wearing and social distancing we can choose to practice when appropriate. And yet, despite the scientific consensus on these safety measures, debate still exists over some of them, especially about the effectiveness of vaccines and mask wearing. So what is the Jewish view on these matters? As I said over the years, pikuach nefesh, the saving of life, is among the preeminent of Jewish values. But aside from this obvious value, there are three other important Jewish principles that should guide our decisions when it comes to best protecting ourselves during the COVID-19 pandemic. The first Jewish principle is Dina de Malchuta Dina, which is a 2,000-year-old Talmudic principle, which means that the law of the land must always be followed. We are not separate from society, and if a given society has passed certain requirements or regulations, from parking laws to income tax payments, we must follow the law of the land. Of course, if the law of the land is objectively and demonstrably unjust, evil, or illegitimate, that's a different story. But barring a flagrant injustice or obviously corrupt regime, the Jewish community must follow this 2,000-year-old dictum of adhering to the laws of the land, especially during the life-threatening COVID-19 pandemic. Which leads us to our second principle, Acharei Rabim Lahatot, which means we must follow the majority rule. The Great Sanhedrin, Beit Din Hagadol, in ancient Israel, was comprised of 71 elders, which among other roles acted as the Supreme Court of Israel. Smaller numbered Jewish courts, Bet Dins, would also follow the same majority rule principle, and still do to this day. Outside of a formal court setting, Jewish rabbinical leaders, when deciding on a given issue, would generally follow the consensus when a matter was being debated. If it was a religious issue, they would follow the consensus of their rabbinical colleagues. If it was an issue involving medicine or science, they would follow the prevailing medical or scientific viewpoint. The majority rules, whether in secular or religious matters. Thus, when looking at COVID-19, almost all rabbinical authorities have cited with approval the scientific consensus regarding the effectiveness of vaccines and mask wearing. The third principle when addressing the issue of COVID-19 from a Jewish perspective is the anchoring of reality over blind faith, science over theology. What I mean by this is that as important as religious principles and texts were to the rabbis, when faced with a provable rationale, theology would always bend to the science. Which is why perhaps we do not really have so many Jewish creationists, i.e. those who disbelieve in evolution and adopt a literal reading of the biblical account of the 6 days of creation. Why? Because if science proves evolution, we will simply reinterpret Genesis and the contradiction is resolved. And as we know, like with the polio and smallpox and measles vaccines, which saves millions of lives, the vast majority of scientific and medical authorities believe the COVID-19 vaccines are a life-saving technology that can also save tens of millions of lives. Are there risks in the vaccines? Yes. But the risks of contracting COVID-19 and coming down with a serious illness or even death are far greater for those who forego vaccinations. Similarly, as we see in all hospitals, masking is a proven technology for preventing the spread of infection. So to summarize, 3 Jewish principles: following the laws of the land, the majority rules, and the acceptance of the scientific consensus are classic, time-honored Jewish values. And yet even in the midst of the Jewish community and even in small pockets of our own congregation, there are those who discount the efficacy and advisability of vaccines and mask wearing. Where do these beliefs come from in general society? And how do we respond to them? How do we account for the fact that earlier this year, 1 in 4 Americans, 25%, said they would refuse to take a vaccine? It is tempting to assume that many of the people who are referred to as anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers are the uneducated and the ignorant. This is too simplistic an interpretation to suggest that anti-vaccine and mask-wearing advocates are solely the purview of the ignorant. Many of those who oppose vaccines and mask-wearing are highly educated, intelligent, and good-hearted people. A recently published paper from an Australian group examined the psychological roots of anti-vaccination attitudes among over 5,000 respondents in 24 countries. The most alarming finding is that the levels of education had no correlation to holding anti-vaccination positions. What it did find was a high correlation between conspiratorial thinking and holding an anti-vaccination position. Thus, we have our first answer to this troubling question. Those who spout anti-vaccine positions are more likely to have a conspiratorial worldview. That means they are deeply suspicious of government, big corporations, and the prevailing worldviews, and thus of the current COVID-19 vaccines and mask-wearing mandates. That big corporations and big governments have not always been the most trustworthy of society's agents is not a great revelation to many of us. In the 1960s, the big tobacco companies launched a disinformation campaign to discredit the link between smoking and lung cancer, even though the connection was abundantly clear to them. At one infamous meeting, a marketing agent explained to tobacco representatives that your product is not tobacco. When he asked them, what do you think your product is? He said, it's not tobacco. Your main product is doubt, referring to the linkage between smoking and cancer that tobacco companies needed to confuse the public about and cast doubt upon. This is similar to some of the major carbon-emitting corporations today, who still try to spread doubt about climate change, claiming that it is still not proven to be affected by human activity. So we can see why some might be suspicious of big government and big corporations. But as a quote goes, a foolish consistency is a hobgoblin of little minds. There are literally hundreds of thousands of scientists, researchers, and other medical professionals around the world who advocate for the vaccine, just as there are those who agree that climate change is real. It beggars belief to suggest that all these people are either useful idiots or part of a nefarious plot with large corporations and governments to poison the world or to implant Bill Gates microchips in our bodies, as you so often hear. But conspiracy theories are not only confined to COVID-19. Natalie Wolchover writes in the online journal Live Science of a study that found that about half of Americans endorse at least one conspiracy theory, from the notion that 9/11 was an inside job to the JFK conspiracy. Quote, many people are willing to believe many ideas that are directly in contradiction to a dominant cultural narrative, Eric Hall Oliver, co-author of the study, noted. Oliver says that, quote, conspiratorial beliefs stem from a human tendency to perceive unseen forces at work, known as magical thinking. Wolchover adds that even the most diehard skeptics among us believe in magic. Humans can't help it. Though we may try to be logical, irrational beliefs, many of which we aren't even conscious of, are hardwired into our very psyches. She concludes by saying most of us try to be rational, but the research suggests remnants of magical thinking we evolved with invariably creep in. So while a penchant for conspiracy theories and magical thinking may be embedded in the human psyche, logical, rational, objective analysis must be our collective ideal in order for humanity to survive and thrive. Related to a penchant for conspiracy theories is a fierce sense of individual freedom that many espouse, and any attempt to encroach on that freedom, no matter how rational, must be resisted at all costs, similar to gun rights advocates who are committed to defending almost unfettered access to even the deadliest of assault weapons. In the same vein, life-saving vaccines and mask mandates have been sadly politicized by many on the extreme right as examples of the left and big government trying to enact the nanny state or take away personal freedom or invade people's private lives. But in Judaism, personal freedom is always superseded by service to God and our obligations to our fellow human beings. And there are countless examples of laws in the Torah and Talmud that require us to take into account the welfare of our fellow human beings and neighbors at great cost to our own personal freedom. Put simply, our obligation to takes precedence over our freedom from. My obligation to mask and vaccinate, which not only protects myself but also protects others, takes precedence over my freedom not to undergo these health safety practices. One more factor in vaccine hesitancy and anti-masking seems to be the distrust that has been sowed for the so-called elites, for the educational class, for the experts. Look at the way perhaps the world's leading infectious disease expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, has been treated by the extreme right media in the US, or the church banners proclaiming faith in Jesus over faith in Fauci, and the death threats that he and his family have received. It goes without saying that Judaism celebrates expertise in the pursuit of knowledge, and the wise scholar has always been held in the highest esteem in Jewish life for thousands of years. In fact, scholarship of the medical kind is possibly the most preferred form of intellectual pursuit among the Jewish people today, perhaps because it combines thought and action, intellectual achievement and helping others. Most of you know the famous joke about the first Jewish president of the United States. His elderly mother arrives at inauguration. She's sitting in the front row next to the Supreme Court justices and the members of the president's future cabinet. She's sitting there beaming, and the man sitting next to her says, "Ma'am, can I ask you what your connection is?" She says, "That's my son, the first Jewish president of the United States." So the man says to the Jewish mother, "You must be very proud of your son, the very first Jewish president of the United States." And the woman says, "Yes, I'm very proud of him, but I'm even more proud of his brother. You see, he's a doctor." Jewish tradition and culture venerate science and knowledge and expertise, especially that of the medical profession, as the joke suggests. Finally, yet another factor in the opposition to vaccines and mask wearing is a desire by some to be the exception to society, to be outliers, to swim against the stream. In this quest to be original, to stand out, not to be, in their words, sheep, they find comfort in bucking the trend, the majority, by purposely adopting minority positions. These self-professed mavericks prefer to do their own research, and I put the word research in quotes, and somehow always seem to gravitate to the minority viewpoints they discover, which buck the scientific mainstream. But most often, that research is not composed of years of working in a lab or combing through research papers, but clicking around the internet, looking for things to prove their preconceived conclusions. A recent cartoon makes this point very well. There's a man sitting in front of his computer, and he yells out to his wife in the kitchen, "Hey honey, look, I just found some research on the internet that millions of the world's greatest scientists and doctors don't even know about." I should add an important point here that I heard in a TED Talk recently. Most of us rely on experts to get us through our daily lives. We use our computers, start our cars, book airplane tickets, turn on air conditioners without having the slightest notion how these things work. But we rely on the expertise and accumulated knowledge of generations of research and current understandings, that these technologies will work properly and we go about our day. The same with, let's say, smoking and lung cancer. Few of us here understand the mechanisms of cancer and how smoking can lead to lung cancer. But we trust the scientists and researchers who have come to the conclusion and thus choose to avoid tobacco products. The same with COVID-19 vaccines. Almost none of us have our own laboratories or expertise in the specific fields of infectious disease and vaccines. So we rely on the vast majority of experts and their conclusions to arrive at our own decisions. For some reason, anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers choose to rely on a much smaller cohort of would-be experts and arrive at a vastly different position. And of course, given the way Facebook and other sites work, once you subscribe to a certain point of view, the algorithms will ensure that you continue to be exposed to the similar points of view, giving you the illusion of a truth through numbers mirage. So how do we approach the so-called anti-vaxxers in our midst? In my experience, for those who have followed the conspiracy theories down the rabbit hole, arguing and debating does not seem to have any purpose. No matter what argument you make, it's like a game of whack-a-mole. Another argument will be substituted in its place, and as soon as you challenge the first position, they'll come up with another position. Their beliefs are so hard-set, absence of an appearance of the creator of the universe, their opinions are impervious to any reconsideration. I recently encountered a highly intelligent young woman who I've known since her childhood, and who is also a steadfast anti-vaxxer. In our discussion, she told me of a Holocaust survivor who claimed that the COVID-19 lockdowns and vaccination policies were worse than her experience in the Holocaust. And she's not alone in making these associations. Just look at Marjorie Taylor Greene in the United States, with her outrageous comparisons between masking mandates and the yellow stars Jews were forced to wear in the Holocaust. Or a recent cartoon that showed an image of the gates at Auschwitz-Birkenau with the words "Arbeit macht frei" replaced by the words "Vaccines will set you free." In other words, according to the cartoon, the advocates of COVID-19 vaccines are akin to Nazi Germany's genocidal practitioners. I challenged that young woman about the absurdity of comparing the attempt to save human life through wearing a mask and life-saving vaccines to hurting and asphyxiating millions of Jews in the gas chambers with the express purpose of annihilating an entire race of people. I further explained how none of the numerous Holocaust survivors I knew would ever make that comparison, and in fact had all been vaccinated and are religiously following the public health guidelines. No sooner had I done that than she presented me with some other piece of research, in quotes, that she found on the internet, and then shifted to, well, this was her gut feeling about vaccines. As was noted in the article on the Australian study above, quote, "It doesn't matter what you say, what evidence you provide. Presenting the facts to those who are anti-vaccine is actually counterproductive because it was never about the facts," close quote. In philosophy, I once came across a discussion about a theory which is completely unfalsifiable. This means a theory is constructed in a way that you can never prove it's false. In philosophy, we are better advised not to engage because if you can never debunk it, there's no point in having a conversation about it because it's not open to true, open discussion and logic. I'm reminded of a Hasidic story where a troubled Jew comes to the rabbi and proceeds to complain about God and all sorts of other flaws of Judaism. But instead of the rabbi confronting the man at every one of his points, the rabbi simply says, "Maybe, perhaps, I hear you," as the man continues to let off steam. Finally, at the end of the conversation, the rabbi looks at him and says, "But after all, perhaps I'm also right?" I'm not sure if the rabbi convinced the man, but perhaps the rabbi's firm but gentle response created a space in the other man's mind for another way of looking at the world. Before I conclude, we should understand that those who are opposed to vaccines and masking do not come in one single flavor, all have the same reasons. One of my closest friends refused to take the vaccines because, in his words, he wanted to wait. He was concerned with how quickly the vaccines were approved and was worried about the possible unknown long-term effects of vaccines. Finally, he said he was confused by some of what he was reading about the efficacy of masks and vaccines and the past history of some of the big pharmaceutical companies not always acting with the best interests of the public. We had a calm discussion in which I pointed out that while some of his concerns were worth considering, the prevailing medical consensus was that for the unvaccinated, the risk of contracting COVID-19 and developing serious illnesses or dying was far greater than any likely short-term or long-term effects from taking the vaccine. That is as much as we know in September 2021, after more than 2 billion people worldwide have been vaccinated against COVID-19 with more than 5 billion doses. I think when we're faced with those holding anti-vaccine or anti-masking positions, we need to understand that many of these people, like my close friend, are sincere in their mistaken beliefs and should not be demonized for that even as we disagree with them. We can acknowledge that current medical science is never 100% and are open to revising our positions should new evidence come to light, but still firmly state our belief in following the medical consensus and not ascribe to conspiracy theories. And finally, convey to them that just as their beliefs are sincerely held, so are ours, and that we have chosen the path that best protects our own lives, those of our families, and those of our communities, a path that is supported by the consensus of the vast majority of the medical and scientific communities. Finally, for those of you who may still be on the fence and have some lingering doubts about the vaccine, allow me to quote Tal Rosh, head of the infectious disease unit at Ashdod University Hospital in Israel, who told the Jerusalem Post last week that while he cannot claim to know what is going to happen in 10 years, quote, "There is no true reason to think that there are any significant long-term effects of the vaccine, that no other vaccine has been evaluated for a decade before approval. In fact," he said, quote, "there's not another example of a vaccine that has been linked to any significant long-term effects. We do not know of any other examples in which the immune system decided to suddenly react to a vaccine that was given 15 years prior," said Michal Liniel, a professor of biological chemistry at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So where does this leave us? As mentioned above, there are 3 Jewish principles that encourage vaccinations and mask wearing. Those principles again are Dina de Malchut Dina, the law of the land that we must follow, the majority rules, and the acceptance of the scientific consensus. Which leads me to my final story, which fits in nicely with the principle of majority rule. There was a group of 4 rabbis who would often get together for discussions. And one time they're having a discussion, and the 3 rabbis decided one way and the one rabbi decided the other way. And very frustrated with his other rabbinical colleagues, he said, "I'm certain I'm so right. Let God intervene. Let a sign come from the heavens." And all of a sudden, some dark clouds began to appear on the horizon. The other rabbi said, "Well, that doesn't prove anything. These are things in nature always change." "Well, if I'm right, let an even larger sign come from God above." And all of a sudden, a huge thunderstorm crashed. A huge amount of lightning started to flash through the sky. And the other rabbis were still unconvinced. "Well, it's just a natural phenomenon. It's not a sign from God." So finally, The rabbi prayed again, God, please show me an even bigger sign that I'm right. And a voice comes from heaven saying, he is right. The other three rabbis look at that first rabbi until one of the rabbis says, okay, so the vote was 3-1. Now it's 3-2. I wish you all a safe and healthy 5782. May all of us follow the accepted COVID-19 health guidelines so we'll be able to meet in person next year. Shana Tova.